Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of Season 2 of House, the Shared Living podcast. I'm Sarah Canning from the Property Marketing Strategists.
I'm Dan Smith from Student Housing Consultancy.
And I'm Deenie Lee from the Property Marketing Strategists.
Let's take a moment to hear from our sponsor, My Student Halls.
Housed, the Shared Living podcast, is sponsored by mystudenthalls.com, student accommodation search. Let's find your place.
Thank you so much for supporting us, and I'm sure My Student Halls at the top of a lot of people's lists at the moment as they're going through budgeting and preparing for the next season of student lettings. So if you haven't already, make sure you get in touch with the team at My Student Halls. Now, on with the show. It feels like it's been a busy time at the moment. So Deenie, Dan and I were actually together. We were all part of an event hosted by Howard Kennedy, which is part of a series of kind of exclusive panel discussions about the future of PBSA in 2030 and beyond. The Property Marketing Strategist was co-hosting it. We were very kindly invited by the team at Howard Kennedy, who really wanted to lift the lid on some potential issues that are going to be facing the sector in the future. And it was very much about not looking back. We feel like a lot of discussions at conferences are looking back or even stuck in the now. And we really felt that we needed to push that conversation on. And Dan, you were drafted in as a last-minute substitution.
Parachuted in as a last-minute substitute for Ilya from the Social Hub, and very grateful for that, to be honest. It was a really interesting debate, and really good panel. Lots of questions afterwards as well, and the networking was really helpful too. We had quite a few BTR players there, as well as just PBSA, and I think that's a bit of a measure of the fact that there's quite a few people looking to get into the PBSA sector from BTR as well. But yeah, really good event and very well moderated, Sarah, may I add.
Thank you very much. I mean, the focus, just to fill you all in, the event was really a focus to look into how the future of traditional student accommodation could change, bearing in mind the emergence of BTR and co-living and looking at the continued demand and rental growth. So Sandra Jones from Price Hubble did a really big piece of research looking into who is living in the wider PRS sector, who will be able to share more about the products and the work that they do. But basically, I guess the moral of the story is it's misleading not to include all living rental asset classes where students have options to rent when you're looking at the headline supply figure. I know we've discussed it before in House, but I think the numbers really illustrated that. Deenie, you were in the audience. What kind of vibe were you getting from people watching? Do you think that it felt like brand new information?
Absolutely. And I think what was the biggest reflection for me and take away was that why are we not looking at this data at all the other conferences we go to about PBSA? Because ultimately what Sandra was saying at high level was that 50% of those students are living in PRS. So that should be taken into account, whereas the other 50% are in PBSA. So there's a big chunk of our market living in HMO, and we don't seem to talk about the whys, the wherefores, what they're doing. Why are they going that way? How can we build a product from that way that they want to come into that PBSA kind of family? And obviously, we've talked extensively around the BTR piece. And I think the standout kind of stat for me was when Sandra shared that 35% of BTR is filled with students in Bristol. And that kind of says a lot, really. And I think it was a great event. I think there's two things: that it was a really different audience, I think, as Dan said earlier, and that is always great to have a different kind of audience coming to these events, interested in what you're hearing. And it was really forward thinking, and it was about, well, actually there are lots of challenges. It's still a good market to be in. There's still lots of positivities in that market, but there's lots of things that we need to look at and we need to change. And it was that conversation to say, well, here's things we can do. And I think that was a really great event to be part of. And I think all those that came there recognised that and understood that.
Yeah, it was a really interesting event. Great location. Crikey, those Howard Kennedy offices just by London Bridge are quite something, as were the canapes. So yeah, thank you very much for the invite. But I was really intrigued by that data. And yes, I'd heard of Data Loft and now Price Hubble. It was great to have Sandra there presenting that. We are a bit lazy in PBSA with looking at the HMO sector and fully understanding that. And I think we've done enough now on Housed, and I've done enough on LinkedIn calling out the fact that there's a huge number of students now living in BTR. It really varies, based on the city. But yes, Price Hubble do say that 35% of BTR residents in Bristol are students. That's that's something to be very mindful of. I don't think that's far off actually a general national average. I did try to push on where that data was from. Was it on council tax exemptions and they're getting it from the local authorities? But I'd like to do a bit more digging into what that looked like. My overall thoughts on that were great to see that data, first and foremost. StuRents do a good job of pulling in HMO data as well, but I think we're in a bit of danger of getting data fatigue in some way, shape or form, primarily from a cost point of view, because of course you have to pay for Price Hubble as you do StuRents and Student Crowd and the CBRE system or the Cushman and Wakefield system or my own data that we collect. And I think that is becoming a little bit more prohibitive to some of these feasibility studies, but you have to do your research now. It's not just a case of build it and they will come, as we know. Therefore, you've got to assess the HMO market. You've got to assess the BTR market. And it seems like Price Hub will have a really good solution for that. So I would say just reach out to Sandra Jones from Price Hubble if you do want to understand what they've got. But it was a really good insight from PBSA understanding what BTR are doing and how many students are actually living in some of those key cities. So yeah, really good event to be part of.
I wrote down some interesting bits while I was moderating. So we had Deborah Udall from Say Property Consulting, who brought with her a wealth of experience from the BTR sector. And when asked, why is it that students are moving in? We've covered this quite extensively, but actually I don't think we've ever covered this element of it, which is she said that a lot of students from abroad are really familiar with apartment living. It's just normal for them to live in a 2-3 bedroom apartment, and that's probably what they've grown up in. So for them, walking a city, looking for somewhere to live or looking online, they're probably gravitating towards a 2-3 bedroom apartment as something that feels familiar and like home. So I thought that was a really interesting perspective. And we have always talked about that PBSA kind of beyond the first year maybe does feel too institutional, and people aren't looking for a room. They're looking for a flat. They're looking for a community. And certainly what we've been discussing about BTR recently would support that. And I think another bit that really struck me was obviously we had Jenny Shaw from Unite, who quite rightly was flying the flag for why PBSA is relevant. But I think what she pointed out is there is some really complex needs coming down the road with students. We know neurodiversity, mental health challenges, and PBSA have done such a good amount of work with training their staff in mental health first aid, in creating supportive networks, in creating kind of well-being processes and procedures that probably BTR operators are going to be less able to manage. So for certain students and potentially disabled students, whether that is a hidden disability or a visible disability, PBSA feels like the right place for them to live still.
Totally agree with all that. And I think that's where PBSA really needs to focus on, is that they need to really capture what they're about and what they're offering and what they're different and that why. And I think that was a really important point that Jenny made. I just wanted to go back to Deborah and her kind of wealth of experience. And I think what was interesting is also where she talked about BTR are already considering BTR lite. And that feels that they've moved there much, much quicker than PBSA has in terms of actually what is our product that isn't as high end, that is for those that are on a budget. And how do we build that? And that is another risk coming down the line for PBSA. And it kind of feels that PBSA needs to start thinking about their PBSA lite and what that might look like.
Is that the affordable sector? That's the holy grail from my side of things at the moment, because we know it's what students want. We know domestic students were the beacon of student applications this year because international student numbers are down. And so, yes, we do need to start thinking about that affordable sector. I think one of the other interesting things that came out of it was talking about the segmentation. I think it might have been Philip Hillman that started to talk about this, but in PBSA, we are starting to see some segmentation with the likes of Vita pushing different brands for graduates. And I know Empiric are doing the same as well. They've got more co-living focus. They've got graduate focus. They've also got properties that are specific to second and third years and those returners and not necessarily undergrads, because the needs are very different. And I think that's what's becoming more apparent, the fact that it's not just one size fits all in student accommodation anymore. Gone are those days where it's primarily Unite and maybe Mansion or some of the other, original players within student accommodation. It's very much now about how can you segment your customers, your residents, to make sure that you are delivering exactly what they need. And that circles back to your point, Sarah, about that Jenny made primarily about the needs of those students, and that they are going to change. It's going to look very different as to how it is now, not just from an affordability perspective, but from the perspective of what those students need and want. How can we make sure in a competitive market, because that's what we have now. We have a very competitive market where occupancy isn't as high as it has been for quite some time. There's some markets showing some signs of stress and maturity, should we say. I didn't say saturation. And I think that is where operators have to think fast, change some of their makeup effectively and some of their values to make sure that they are more applicable to, and the product is more applicable to those students who are going to need it. So yeah, lots of work for PBSA to do, I see, because BTR is certainly stealing a bit of a march on it. HMOs still remaining popular, but we know that may change. So yeah, there's lots going on in the sector, crikey. But it was a great event to showcase all of that for sure.
I think Jade Chalmers, who works for Howard Kennedy in the planning department, she did bring up that actually co-living is starting to look a little bit worrying potentially. Planners are concerned about the quality and size versus the expense. And it's actually more higher earners and older people that seem to be moving into co-living. So I'm not saying eliminate it from feasibility or competitor analysis if you're in student accommodation, but I think it's looking at it on a city by city, operator by operator base. But for some of those co-living schemes, it feels like they might not be such competitors versus a shared flat in BTR.
I think it comes back to the segmentation thing, is that we need to understand what we're building and who we're building for, whether that's a co-live property, a BTR property, a PBSA property. I think the other point that made, that I think was by Philip Hillman, was around, which we heard also, again, when we were at UK Reef, which is always positive for us to hear, is this kind of actually PBSA or shared living needs to go down the route of branding the way that hotels have. Like, we need to put that focus on brands and what each brand you've got, or whether it's property or brand, is saying to its audience and who's it for. And we don't really have that. And with this, I think there is a change of conversation around branding PBSA, which is obviously what Sarah and I set out to achieve. So that's great to see, but it needs to be more defined. It needs to be more considered and needs to be really focused on that segmentation and what is that product for and who is it speaking to.
For those of you that think that was a shameless plug for property marketing strategists, you'd be right. But at the same time, I totally agree. We have to make sure that the brand for each operator, whether it's that sub-brand of postgrads or whatever it might be, and the brand of each property is totally relevant to the students that it's trying to attract. And I walk into so many properties and I see so many websites where I just think, this is missing a massive trick, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. But how do you know what that low-hanging fruit is unless you have a marketing review? I just think everybody needs to be looking inwards and also then thinking about what that's going to look like in 5-10 years' time. If you can future-proof your brand now, then great, because BTR and co-living are starting to become and PBSA are starting to become more of a blended shared living sector. And that's, again, something to be mindful of. But to bring that back to the panel discussion, I'm seeing a lot of potential PBSA sites becoming slightly concerned that BTR or co-living is easier to push and that you can fill that property with students anyway. So why would you restrict your planning to students only when co-living may work? Now, I think that's a bit of a misnomer, to be completely honest. I don't think that there's a full understanding of exactly what co-living is. And I had this chat with Scott Lewis from Homes for Students and Catherine from Verve Life. They're sort of one and the same part of the same group company at Homes for Students, but co-living is a lot more complicated than people realize. I think it's not just a case of, well, I could just fill it with students and that means it's a bit more defensive an asset. I think there are some nuances there in terms of the operation and what that looks like. We do need to do a bit more digging into how to separate co-living BTR and PBSA, or maybe that ends up becoming that homogenous shared living sector that we discussed, and then certain subsets within it. But I think that planning authorities do need to get a bit of a handle on exactly what is going to be built and what is needed. And I don't think there is the appetite or the resource in any planning department in the UK at the moment, in any local authorities or within government, to fully understand how PBSA, co-living and BTR can work together to benefit a city, to drive down the cost of rental, the cost of living, because that's what you want from more supply, but ultimately to benefit the resident. So I think that there's a lot of work that the government need to do in particular. And I'm very concerned with what I'm seeing so far coming from the government when you look at the renters reform bill. So yeah, lots of things up in the air at the moment with the shared living sector.
Well, I'm glad that we've kind of segued on to talking about the future, because Deenie and I have done a little bit of a mini piece of research looking at Gen Alpha. So kind of our view really is that the first Gen Alphas are going to be renting in student accommodation from around 2030. So really anything that is coming out of the ground in planning, being designed at the moment, should really have a Gen Alpha eye on it, because otherwise it could become out of date really, really quickly. I think there's lots of things that we've just discussed about kind of policy and the convergence of different asset classes. We didn't ask 12-year-olds about that when we did this piece of research, because quite frankly, they wouldn't have a clue what we're talking about. But we did ask them about lifestyle, how they live, the technology they use, how they consume. And we just think that there's a few different elements to it that if you're designing buildings for the future, that you should really think about. Deenie, I know that you've got some of our stats to hand.
I was going to say, this probably is a shameless plug, Dan, in the sense that this was a tiny piece of research that we did. It was only 50 respondents, so we can't take it as read. But I think what we found out was really, really interesting, and we'd love it if someone would want to get in touch with us to expand it and do more, because I think it would be really valuable to the sector. So that is a shameless plug. But on with the stats. So yeah, it was just a small respondent pool that we managed to get for this, because it is very hard to find Gen Alpha. But I think it was interesting what we discovered. We asked around kind of future education, and I think the positive sign for the sector was that 41% plan on applying for university. And bearing in mind the majority of these were 12 to 13 or 14 to 15. So it was about 50% 12 to 13 and 40% 14 to 15-year-olds. So even at that age, they are considering university. So I think that is saying something, though a big chunk of them are actually also don't really know, I want to find a job, which may be linked into this apprenticeships growth. So I think there is still a conversation that we've talked about in house, that we talk about in our conferences, that there's a whole sector of education, which is degrees or also apprenticeship degrees, that can't access any kind of student housing at all. And that is a growing sector of people that might be interested in doing that. I think the other kind of interesting information that we found out was around that actually 42% of them did believe that the cost of a degree was between £5,000 and £10,000, which obviously is around that at the moment. But a lot of others didn't have an idea of where it was costing. So there is a lot more that can be done around that communication piece around this is actually what it's going to go and cost to study.
I think the other interesting bits was about technology. Young people are using apps, not websites. So we always talk when we're looking at web design about mobile first, but actually should we be talking about app first? Because, you know, they're not going on to Internet Explorer looking for stuff. You know, they're using the apps that they're really familiar with. I mean, I know my son, who's just turned 13, the list of apps that he's got on his phone, you know, and he's got them all organized into folders of different kind of themes, but it's, you know, that is how he's accessing businesses and information. So I think for me that was a kind of standout statistic. And also the way they spend money, you know, a lot of them have apps that are linked potentially to their parents so that they know what the spending is. They're not interested in cash, generally speaking, and you know, they are used to seeing their spend. I think, you know, they're spending it on the app, but they're very, very conscious of what they're spending and how they're spending it.
I think the other interesting point on technology was around smart technology in the home, whereas we did do a kind of a side-by-side thing with Gen Z, and 51% of Gen Z have smart technology in at home, but for Gen Alpha, this is 94%. So if you haven't got smart technology in your PBSA when they arrive, that's going to be quite a shock to the system for them, I think.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things, is that it's not just about the product. I think, it's about the way that young people are going to book. I mean, we do a lot of work on websites, and the hardest bit is the integration with a booking system. And these Gen Alphas are not going to have the patience for it. They do not want to be filling forms in. They'll expect it all to be auto-populated. They're going to be expecting AI to understand who they are, where they are. And if they've already filled information in once, they ain't going to be doing it again. So I think, that was the kind of the real, I guess, focus, really. Like I said, we didn't ask them about their accommodation because I don't think they don't have the context for it. But I think the way they live, like Deenie said, shameless plug, but people should be wanting to find more out about that and creating a product that is future proof.
I'd say just the one positive thing is that we did get a couple of our respondents to do some videos on some key questions, and the really nice thing that came out of this was they all really, really were positive about in-person, face-to-face socialising. And that came across so strongly that actually, yes, they like messaging each other. Yes, they like chatting when they're not together. But really what they're craving is that face-to-face contact. And I just think that is a really nice thing to see and hear and know.
That's really important from a future of universities perspective. We aren't just talking about academia here. We are talking about life experience and socializing. And so I think that there will always be a place for student accommodation rather than purely online courses. Now, actually, we've seen it in Australia. There is a university in Australia that's gone pretty much purely online. I will be very interested to see how that goes. And I think we should have a look at that and kind of report back on that at some point in the future. With students, Gen Alpha, they're born 2010 onwards, and which makes me feel incredibly old. But I think tech is changing so much and so quickly with the advent of AI in particular. But you look at a lot of our property management systems, there's some legacy systems there. Some of them have moved with the times, some of them haven't. There are some new challenges that are also coming in. And I think that our tech system within PBSA has held us back to a certain extent. There are some brilliant property management systems out there for sure. But I think that, with the advent of AI, with the focus on automation, streamlining, one click to book, I don't think you can get away anymore with having a clunky booking system. And that's one of the primary focuses of a lot of operators and investors at the moment. And I think that anybody who wins that battle to make sure that the booking journey is really nicely streamlined, very attractive, and it meets the students where they want on the platform that they want, whether that is WeChat or even WhatsApp or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, it doesn't matter. You have to meet those students where they are. And I don't think that operators are doing a good enough job of taking students through that platform, through that social media, through that engagement into a booking engine. That needs a lot of work. And I think that anybody that nails that will create that seamless customer journey and book a hell of a lot more students than their competitors. So there's a lot of work that is being undertaken by some fairly pioneering operators, but it's still relatively slow. And I don't think it's going to have caught up within sort of 3 years. But there's some opportunities out there. I'd certainly welcome the opportunity to chat to anyone in particular that's looking at anything pioneering or has any good innovations. And I'm having a lot of conversations with a lot of big operators and small about AI at the moment, so would welcome more discussions on that as well.
One thing that's been on my mind that, as you know, I like to share is dynamic pricing. And I think it keeps rearing its head because I'm still hearing a lot about international students preferring more expensive properties, booking, later. And I feel like a lot of this is out of their control. They're booking later generally because they don't feel comfortable booking until they've got a place at a university or a visa. So they're already being pushed much later into it, by which point the dynamic pricing in a lot of markets has gone out of control. So in PBSA, they're renting later and they're paying higher prices. And then that's then making people think that international students like spending more money. They like buying, they like renting expensive studios. and that so the cycle continues. And is it ethical that different people are being charged something different depending when they book, when it's not their fault if they can or can't book at that time generally? So, it comes back, I guess, to what Dean and I are often saying about knowing who your market is. If your market are current first years and second years who will be second and third years, they're already in your city, they can book early, and the people that book early should get loyalty rates. Totally agree with that. But the people that are coming later, like through clearing or because they're international students, they're not doing it out of choice. And I just wonder if it's fair that they always get lumbered with higher rates. What do you guys think?
Well, first of all, I wonder what Liam and Noel think about dynamic pricing and what their view is. Is it ethical? But I've always said this. I don't think it. I think there's dynamic pricing for certain things is there because you're rewarded for being organised and booking early, and it's a demand issue. But if you can't book at the same time as someone else, or because the system is not set up in that way, then it's not really fair and it's not really dynamic pricing, because an international student generally doesn't know where they're going, doesn't have got their visa, so aren't going to book. So all they're doing is penalised because they can't actually book earlier. It's not like you and I getting a flight and we know that we can get a flight 3 months cheaper. That flights aren't really fair in a sense, but at least you know that actually if I'm going to do something and I book early enough, I'll get a much cheaper flight, and then you're penalised for doing it later. That makes a bit more sense, but it kind of feels that really we don't have a system or a structure that really means that, which is why I'm always pushing around optimize your rates, get the right rate for your product, make sure you're selling those benefits of those products, and you'll get the right revenue for what you're meant to be getting. And you can be more confident when you're selling in saying, actually, when you're buying at a price, you're buying at the price that is right for our product. So no, I'm not entirely convinced by dynamic pricing in this sector, and never really have been.
I'm not convinced that dynamic pricing works within PBSA. I do not think it's fair that there are so many properties now that have late discounts that someone that booked early in the sales cycle and gave that investor and that operator the reassurance that they were at a certain sales velocity by December or March or May or whenever has paid quite a lot more in certain circumstances. And just to let you know, there's cashbacks of £2,250 that I've seen now in some locations. And obviously that's because we're, coming towards the end of or the middle of October. But this is a problem that we've been grappling with in PBSA for a long time. And we've tried to follow hotels, airlines, the hospitality industry, and travel primarily, because that's the best insight that we've got, the best benchmark that we've got. But they're selling on a nightly basis or a daily basis, and therefore you can gauge the demand constantly, and that will flex up and down. Taylor Swift, has a concert, fine, put your prices up. That will happen in and around Wembley or wherever. With student accommodation, it is very different, and you're selling once, maybe 3 times a year, depending on if you've broken down into semesters. And the ideal goal, I'm sure we can all agree, is that you reward those people that book early on, that give you that reassurance and that security of early bookings so that you can track your sales velocity through the market. Now, with the big discounts that we are seeing at the moment, that is then biting us in the arse in August and September, because of the discounting, and the students having booked early are rightly going to the operators and saying, hang on a minute, I booked early. Why have I not got my £2,000 cash back? Where's that for me? I found that really difficult to deal with at Nido, even sort of 7 years ago, trying to understand how to make sure that we can fill those buildings. So that is a real challenge that we've always had in PBSA. And to talk about dynamic pricing, it's not dynamic pricing, it is tiered pricing. I do understand that investors want to drive those rates through the year, but we typically talk about dynamic pricing or tiered pricing with a view to pushing that pricing up, not necessarily pushing the pricing down towards the end to drive occupancy. And that's where we've got a bit of a challenge as we move through the tiers, that, and to try and increase rates as we go based on certain occupancy levels, that we get to the end of the season and actually it's a fire sale, right? Just knock out £200 cashbacks, drop £50 off a room per week. I think that we aren't getting it right. We do need to take stock a little bit in terms of the way we do our pricing. And, yes, I do understand there should be some form of tiered structure, but we just have to get our pricing right in the first place. It's about understanding what that potential demand should be and speaking to the universities, speaking to the international education agents, starting to really do some better crystal ball gazing. Again, that's what both of our consultancies can help to do, of course. But this isn't just a shameless plug. I think that it's on us as an industry to do a better job of setting our prices right. I am seeing that's happening. There is a bit more realism in the market for setting prices for 25-26 academic year than previously. I'm not seeing double-digit rises. I'm seeing the latest Unite report, for example, is talking about a 3 to 4% increase for rents year on year, whereas last year on year, 8.2%. So there's definitely some realism and a bit of a recalibration in the market that may help. But yeah, I think we just need to just reset, take stock, and start to think about what dynamic pricing actually means for PBSA.
I think the point that cashbacks aren't an unusual thing in this sector, it's something that happens year on year, proves that we get our pricing wrong year on year.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that a lot of that is, I mean, some of it's market driven. There were some things this year where you couldn't necessarily have predicted the extent to which some of these universities dropped in terms of their application and student numbers, or the fact that they didn't pick up enough in clearing. But to be honest, some of these signs were very much there. Some of the key markets we were called to do some of these performance reports and really have a look at what was driving some of the difficulties and challenges in the market. You could have predicted that a mile off. I can sit here now and say to you, I think that the problems next year that we've had this year won't necessarily be exacerbated, but they won't be alleviated. I still think we'll see a drop in Chinese students. I think domestic students will either plateau or maybe a slight increase, as we've seen this year, which is good. A little bit of a pickup in clearing. That didn't really affect PBSA too much because our pricing isn't necessarily akin to attracting the domestic market. And then you think about, well, everybody missed the BTR piece, the fact that in Leeds, 30% of the residents in BTR are actually students, which is a significant proportion, and the pipeline's gigantic. There are so many things that could be taken into account. I actually think that a lot of this comes down to operators not necessarily having enough time to dedicate to specific properties, specific markets, really deep diving on some of the competitor analysis, the pipeline, and effectively doing those feasibility studies that we would do, or your Knight Franks, Savills, JLLs, Cushman, Wakefield, CBRE, Colliers, whoever else would be doing those feasibility reports. I think that almost needs to be done by an operator every single year when they're setting their pricing, to look at all of those factors considered, speaking to the unis, speaking to the agents and the marketplaces to get a gauge of what is happening in the market and a bit of crystal ball gazing. Because, for me, it's as simple as talking to people like Jason from UHomes and saying, what do you think of the Chinese market next year? What data do you have this year? And what are you thinking about next year for specific markets? I think that we're missing a bit of a trick in the way we set our prices, but also then how we react to any kind of slowing of velocity.
But I think my point is that we've been having cashback promotions since year dot. This is a pre-COVID thing that we've been having. It's not a new thing, which means that the market has got into its head that that's how we price. And it's like, well, it doesn't work. The whole reason that you're doing that is because that's never in your strategy. Your strategy never starts with, oh, let's chuck some cashbacks up at the end of the year. It's because you're getting it wrong, but we've been getting it wrong since, it's been an issue since I've been in the sector, and that's more years than I care to say.
I think that there has to be, this year coming, a real focus on occupancy. That sounds incredibly obvious, but for me, occupancy is sanity, and revenue is not necessarily vanity, but it does have to come secondary. You have to fill your beds first. And of course, the ideal goal is that you fill your final bed on check-in weekend, so you don't have any voids at all, and that you've done your due diligence on each student. They're turning up, they've paid their first instalment, or whatever that might look like, or their first monthly payment, depending on what happens with the renter's rights bill. But that, I don't think, is feasible in the difficult markets that we currently have, and I mean that across the board. It's not been an easy market anywhere across the UK, and there will be certain cancellations that couldn't necessarily be foreseen. But I think we have to be very mindful of the fact that all of these markets are now different. We can't rely on making sure that we can sell out by check-in weekend. I would always prefer to sell out that little bit earlier now. And this is what I'm advising my clients. Take that occupancy push, be a little bit cautious with your pricing in the first instance. If there is an opportunity to push that pricing slightly higher, then great. But we're talking marginal gains now. We're not talking like last year or the year before where we saw a difference of 30 to 50% in some locations like Glasgow. I saw a couple of room categories that had pushed their price 50% throughout the course of the year. That is categorically not sustainable and is outright greed, if we're being completely honest. So I think we just need to be really mindful of how we push the pricing, how much we can expect from that tiered pricing, and then manage the issues that you would have with so-and-so finding out they're paying £5 or £10 more per week than someone else, depending on when they booked in the sales cycle. So I do think that tiered pricing is kind of here to stay. Dynamic pricing is a different thing entirely. We should be getting rid of those cashbacks. They shouldn't be a thing, but they are, because there's a lot of operators that haven't found it particularly easy to sell this year. And we should all be front loading our booking season by focusing on rebookers, early domestics and early Chinese in particular, and then pushing students to book that little bit earlier from an international perspective. Maybe the government can help with that in terms of the visa and international student rhetoric that we've seen coming out of the previous Conservative government. It should get a little bit easier under Labour, but we just don't know. So there's a lot to be said for front-loading your bookings in a year where you think it may be challenging, really focusing on those rebookers, early domestics, early Chinese students, and then pushing your students to book as early as possible.
So what we'd like to see is loyalty being rewarded, and then the price readjusted to fill the rooms but not messed around with during the year, so that everybody, whether they book in January or whether they book in August, gets the same access to the same rates. So any operators out there that are going to take that approach, we'd love to hear from you. On that topic, I think we will leave it there. Thank you all very much for listening today, and thank you once again to our sponsor, My Student Halls, for supporting us this series. We'll be back next week for some more news and insight, and please subscribe and share with your network and colleagues. Thank you very much.